What do we know about Luke? Our first paragraph here in our book, The Gospel According to Luke. Gospel, incidentally, is an English word. It means the good news. So the Gospel According to Luke. Let's look at the opening paragraph. Seeing that many others have undertaken to draw up accounts of the events that have reached their fulfillment among us, as these were handed down to us by those who from the outset were eyewitnesses and ministers of the word, I, in my turn, after carefully going over the whole story from the beginning, have decided to write an ordered account for you, Theophilus. This is a dedication to this figure, Theophilus, which would be a Greek name, so that your excellency may learn how well founded the teaching is that you have received. So what do we know about Luke and his book from that first paragraph? Number one, we know that as of the time that he writes this, many others have drawn up accounts. So that's very important, very helpful for us to know that as of this date, whatever date you want to pick, 65, let's say it's 65 or 66, 67, that already, and that's 30-year window, not much. You can remember 30 years ago, right? Seeing that many others have undertaken to draw up accounts of the events. So that means that already at this point in his life, he's aware of many accounts. Also, it tells us that he was not an eyewitness. So second key thing about him. He's not an eyewitness. He wasn't there. He didn't see it. He tells us that right in his introductory paragraph. We know that there are already many accounts around, written up, drawn up, and that they were handed down by people, some of whom were eyewitnesses and not, and that he isn't. So now he says, I will, in my turn, after carefully going over the whole story from the beginning, have decided to write an ordered account for you, Theophilus, so that your excellency may learn how well founded the teaching is that you've received. In other words, he's telling us that he is going to write a history. Now, I have no idea why so many people write books and preach sermons and tell you that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are not histories. But you must have heard that somewhere in your life. It's fairly general, and it's completely wrong. It's just wrong. These men knew they were writing down the story as best they could do. There's no question that Luke is the best at careful historical research and thinking things through. There's no question. He's the best, and I'll show you the ways. But still, all four of them, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and the letters of Paul, are attempting to tell as best they can, whether they're eyewitnesses or not, of what happened. So when you run across somebody telling you, these aren't histories, these are, myths, poems? What are they if they're not histories? They are histories. What Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are trying to do is tell you what happened as best they can. As far as they know, they're not lying. Now, I know that in their stories, there are accounts of miracles. And so people in the 21st century often discount those little stories because of the miraculous element. Now, if you so automatically discount any event in all of human existence, if it has a slightly miraculous quality to it, don't bother reading the New Testament ever again. Skip it. Because little tiny miracles like turning water into wine are nothing. The big one is coming at the end of this story. So if you're worried about turning water into wine, I say skip the New Testament, go get on Facebook, enjoy yourselves, and don't worry about this stuff because it's full of miracles. It's full of stories. But just because they're miraculous doesn't mean they're untrue, and we as 21st century people should be at least willing to listen to the accounts. And so we start then with a very important piece of information from the Institute and from Professor Fredlund, and that is Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John most definitely are trying to write good histories. Now, do we have verification from anybody else who isn't a Christian that these things happened? Yes, we do. We have Tacitus right here. I just read it to you. And we could go to some other historians who were in other places, like Josephus, a great Jewish historian, who also confirms these events from a different point of view. So, it's not like we have no other source to know something about the events that Luke is writing about. So that's the first thing we find out about him. He's trying to write a history in the first century. He tells you that. He says, I've looked at other documents, and there are a lot out there, and people are, telling their story. I would like to write an ordered account. That's what history is supposed to be, an ordered account. And so he tells you he's going to try and write an ordered account. So he's telling you that. He tells you he's not an eyewitness. He's going to write an ordered account. He's carefully gone over the story from the beginning. And he's dedicating it, so to speak, to Theophilus, to a Greek-named Roman official, because everybody's in the Roman Empire at this point. So Theophilus is most definitely a Greek official in the Roman Empire, could very well be in Greece, could be a Roman official in Greece of Greek background. And Luke is in touch with him and knows him and is passing to him this book. He's sending him this book. So therefore, we know a lot of things about Luke from that opening paragraph. Let me just put up some of the things that we know about him based on a reading of his whole book and the Acts. So the Acts of the Apostles, which we'll turn to next week, is his second book. So he's an author of 2 books. And with the 2 books, we know a lot about him as a person and as a writer from analyzing the book. What's the book written in? What language is it written in? Greek. And everybody should know that, because that was the reason we talked about Alexander. That's the reason we talked about Alexander, is that he spreads Greek all over the world, and therefore Greek is available to people regardless of where they're living. Luke is not a Greek, but he has Greek as a language. If he's born and grew up and was educated in Antioch, he has Greek, like Paul has Greek. They both have Greek, and they will both have Latin, because they're going to be in Rome. So they're trilingual, at least. Number one, he wasn't from Jerusalem, and we know that by virtue of all the other people, the names, the individuals who are in this story, and what he tells us. He's not from Jerusalem. He's from Antioch. You know where Antioch is. It's in that little corner, right at the border, more or less, between Syria and present-day Turkey. So very close to the Battle of Isis that we talked about on our Alexander night. Very close to that corner of the place where the Turkish southern border stops, and then that border turns south into Syria. So he's from Antioch. Aramaic is not his first language. The reason we know that is he refers to it frequently, the way that someone does who is not primarily a Hebrew-speaking or Hebrew Aramaic using person. Luke is certainly the most important Gentile among the first generation of writers. He's not Jewish, because there are enough references in his in the things he says that makes it clear he's not Jewish. His name is a Latin name, Luke, Lucius. And so that strengthens the possibility that he's a Roman citizen, whether his first language is Greek or not. What we know is that when he quotes the Old Testament, the Jewish Bible, when he quotes it, he uses the Greek version of it, the one written in Alexandria. So that's interesting. You see, he's not a Jew. He's not from Jerusalem. Otherwise, he'd use the original. So when he quotes the Old Testament, he uses Greek. And he refers to the Aramaic language the way someone does when it isn't their first language. Okay? So that tells you a few things. Gentile, not a Jew, not from Jerusalem. Greek is probably his first language. Number two, Luke is a doctor. And that's very, very important. And there's a whole number of things. Doctors have written books about Luke, looking at all of what he's written. Everybody agrees he was a doctor. He was trained as a doctor. And that means he has a certain kind of an education, and that means he has the best education you could get. So if you're trained as a doctor in the first century, somewhere there in Antioch or in that part of the Roman Empire, you have the best education that someone can get. It is part of philosophy, so it's part of that wide study like an Aristotelian oversight. It gives you a very, very sophisticated education. Maybe he was educated in Tarsus, which is Paul's city, possible. But the important thing is he has an international education, a Greek education, Greek language, very sophisticated vocabulary. Here's a fascinating thing, and I know none of us would know this. We have to have an expert in Greek. But he has 800 words in his vocabulary that the other three don't even have. So his vocabulary is way bigger than Mark, Matthew, and John. So he's a better educated man of the four than any of the other three. And his education is Greek language and very sophisticated. His Greek is very, very good. It's the best in all of the New Testament. He has a very sophisticated sense of style and classical structures, parallelisms, things that you do, building up Old Testament stories with new. It's all a work of great skill. Number three, Luke is very international and Roman. He dedicates that book to a Roman official, Theophilus, who may have been a very powerful Roman. He may have been an important office of some kind. He always sets his stories or story in the context of Roman history. So he sets the birth of Jesus, as you would see here in the next paragraphs, in the days of King Herod of Judea. He goes on to give you the context of the story. He always sets his story in the context of Roman history, since the birth of Jesus in the reign of Augustus and Herod of Judea. Luke is the only gospel writer who names a Roman emperor, and he names three: Augustus, Tiberius, and Claudius, so that he's well informed about Roman history, Roman politics, Roman life, and of course, remember, he is going to spend time in Rome. He's going to spend time in Rome, so he knows Rome. He frequently relates the stories of John or Jesus, the ministry, to Greek stories and parallels between. He has a very detailed knowledge of Roman imperial officialdom. He knows the titles. He knows the offices that they hold. He understands. He has a very sophisticated knowledge of Asia Minor. There are no geographical mistakes, so he obviously traveled widely. And Luke knows Rome itself. And then, of course, finally, Luke is a companion of Paul. We get we sections in the Acts, meaning he and Paul were together, which we'll talk about next week. And we know that he's with Paul when Paul goes to Rome via Malta. He's with him in the boat wreck. And then he's with Paul in Rome in those last days. Paul himself says in his own letters that Luke is with me.